Okay, so we're going to talk about drawing and the creative process. Many artists regard drawing as deeply important to their creative processes. Some artists demonstrate exceptional drawing ability as children, and there are some artists that really needed to work at it to develop the skill, just like any other skill. So Paul Cézanne is one of them that had a hard time at first, but eventually, through practice, developed his skill. And Vincent Van Gogh, surprisingly enough, one of the most famous artists out there, did not start out with an obvious drawing ability. He had to develop his drawing skill through diligent effort. So we're actually going to take a look at a couple of his pieces and how his drawing was able to kind of progress over time. And drawing can appear really simple, but it's actually quite hard. So here's an early example by Vincent Van Gogh, and it kind of shows how his drawing is not quite as developed as it could be at this early stage. And he learned a great deal about both seeing and painting through his practice of drawing. He was just beginning his short career as an artist when he made this drawing, Carpenter, in 1880, with black crayon. And as you can see, the figure is kind of stiff and clumsy in proportion, but you do see that he has quite the attention, to detail here as well. So you can see some glimmer of hope here in this piece that, he's going in the right direction. And like I said, he had to work really hard at being good at drawing. He had to spend a lot of time, and he was very dedicated. So this drawing was done just 2 years later, and as you can see, that his drawing has really progressed. So the proportions of the man's body are greatly improved, and the detail is much deeper. He's also able to portray some emotion here, so the old man's grief. Through the rendering of the man's body, his body language is really showing a lot of grief and emotion. So with the last example being quite stiff, this man has a lot of body language, and he has a fairly natural bodily proportions as well. And the lines do appear to be drawn quickly and with a relative amount of self-assurance. And there is that example from the book where someone once asked a famous artist how long it took him to do this simple drawing, and the artist replied, 40 years. So even though it's a simple drawing, it took him that long to develop the skill, and I thought that was kind of an interesting little story there. So purposes of drawing, we can go on past that here. Basically serves three functions. So the first one, a notation, sketch, or record of something seen, remembered, or imagined. 2, study or preparation for another, usually larger, more complex work. So we've seen a couple examples of that briefly. We'll look at some more. And as an end in of itself, as a complete work of art. So some people actually use drawings as the finished product. So we're going to take a look at each one of these types of kind of purposes of drawing. So as we've already seen, examples of drawings used as notation, sketched, record of something seen, remembered, or imagined. So we're going to look at another piece here by Michelangelo. It's reclining nude for the painting of the figure of the Sistine Chapel ceiling. So he's actually going to be kind of just doing sketches of a reclining male nude in preparation for the Sistine Chapel, which is one of his greatest works. So we'll take a look at that piece now. So here we go. Study of a reclining nude from 1511. It's red chalk over stylus underdrawing. It's actually not very large. It's around 7 5/8 by 10 1/4 inches in size. So this kind of shows a more detailed study of a reclining nude. And this was to help him with his paintings of figures on the ceilings of the Sistine Chapel. So you guys might actually recognize this because this is actually, I believe this is Adam. So this will be Adam. He's, reclining on this arm. He has one of his arms outstretched, and he's actually reaching out to touch the joining finger of God coming into him. So it's actually kind of a famous figure from the Sistine Chapel. And this is just an exploration, a discovery. He's trying to draw what he observed. He might have had a male, person come in, and a male model come in and kind of draw from the model, basically. And he knew a lot about anatomy, which helped him actually develop the drawing of the muscles on this figure. And parts of the figure that he felt needed further study, he drew repeatedly. So you can see the hand has been drawn a few times, and hands are really hard to draw. So when it comes to the human figure, it's said that faces are probably the hardest thing to draw, and then next up would be the hand, because there's just a lot of proportion and detail that you have to get right. So you can see there's a hand here, there's a hand here, hands here and here. So he's really trying to get those hands right. Like I said, they're really hard to get right. So he's just practicing for the Sistine, for a more famous painting on the Sistine Chapel. So that is an example of just kind of prepping for a larger, more serious work. So here's another one, Pablo Picasso. This is his first composition for the study of Guernica, May 1st, 1937. So it's just pencil on blue paper. The paper doesn't look blue, but I guess. So it's just a quick sketch. It's the actual finished piece is much larger. It's actually a painting, but he's trying to work out problems of overall design and concentrate, rather than concentrating on the small details. And he did a lot of these studies in preparation for his major painting, Guernica. And Guernica is actually 11 feet by 25 feet, so it's huge. And 45 of Picasso's studies are preserved and dated and show the element of evolution in this work. So it's kind of cool to look at these quick studies. So we can kind of look through. Here's a more developed composition, still rather quickly done, but definitely way more detail. So you can kind of see how he's starting to kind of bring in more detail. So as you can see, his final piece is different from the first quick sketch or that second sketch that we looked at. But you can still see some of the basic elements are there. And it's a pretty famous painting. And I do have a video on this that I'm going to be putting in the week content area, I believe, and we'll be working with that later. So I'm going to skip over that, and we'll kind of talk about how preliminary sketches are not generally considered finished pieces, but a lot of times they are treasured for their intrinsic beauty of process. So it's kind of cool to see that process of those sketches. So like the ones we just looked at that Picasso did for Guernica. Okay, so we're going to talk about cartoons. The original meaning of cartoon is a full-size drawing made as a quick guide for work in another medium. So usually for a mural, mosaic, or a tapestry. Artists often use cartoons as overlays for tracing to complete the final work. In today's usage, the word cartoon actually refers to a narrative drawing emphasizing humorous or satirical content. So we'll kind of go over drawing tools and their characteristic techniques and some of the tools and techniques of drawing. So each drawing tool that you use and each type of paper has different characteristics as well. And they influence how the final drawing will turn out. So this is a, kind of a image of different drawing tools here. So we have a pencil, maybe a Conte crown, a brush, which creates a different line than some of the others. This is kind of like more of a traditional pen point here. These two are slightly different sizes. And then this is more of like a modern pen, like maybe I don't know if that's a ballpoint, but you can see the different types of line they create, which is interesting. So some give a dry, refined lines. Some are wet, like this paintbrush, and a little bit more expressive and kind of irregular. And each tool responds differently to different degrees of pressure. The ink brush in the middle is probably the most responsive, and the pen at the bottom is probably the least responsive of each of these tools. Artists often draw rows of parallel lines to suggest shading or volume, and these lines are called hatching. So that's actually a word that you want to know, is hatching. So the different hatching methods are actually illustrated in a diagram that we'll look at. So parallel lines suggest shadows or volumes. Cross-hatching, we can see that in a piece here in a minute. And contour hatching, we'll look at that too. So there's a couple different types of hatching. So the closer the lines are together, the more dense the shadow will be perceived as, and the further away, the more light will be there. So we'll take a look at the types of hatching. So here from left, this is A is hatching, B is cross hatching. So they're actually crossing the lines to create more depth in the shadow, like to create kind of a darker value. And then contour hatching actually kind of follows the contour of a surface. So contour hatching it actually is kind of a technique that goes with the shape of the object that the artist is trying to depict. So the closer the lines are together, the darker the value becomes, and really tight lines will illustrate shadow a lot of the time, and then lines that are further apart are lit areas of the surface of objects being depicted in the illustration. So we'll kind of take a look at Bartolomeo Passaorti. He used 3 different methods. So simple hatching on a standing figure, contour hatching on the upper side of the bulging arm, and cross hatching in darker areas. So printmakers regularly use these types of hatching techniques to suggest mass and shadow. So here we go. Studies of a left arm and young woman, undated, probably 16th century, pen and iron gall ink on laid paper. Pretty small, 7 7/8 by 11 3/8. So you can see there's some contour hatching where he's following the contour, the shape of the hand here. And there's some contour hatching here, following the muscles here. And then there's cross hatching where he's creating shadow and value, darker values within the piece. So he's using a lot of different techniques here as far as hatching goes. Let me check and see how much time we have on this video really quick. Okay, I think I can keep going for a little bit longer. Most drawing surfaces are smooth, but some papers have tooth, which is a quality of roughness or surface grain that gives texture to a drawing. So it's not just the actual drawing tool, but it can also be the texture of the paper that affects. So we're going to look at George Seurat, L'Echo. He used a really toothy paper, and you can really see that tooth in the paper of this piece. And this is actually a detail from Lecho, maybe it's Lecho. It's black Conte crown on Michelet paper. And it's a child's face with a cupped hand, and you can actually see the wave of the paper fibers in this piece. I think I'm going to wrap it up here.